Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at Codemasters' recently released entry to the Formula 1 game series F1 2022, and see how it compares visually from last year's F1 2021. For this comparison, both games have been played and recorded on the PC, with their graphics settings cranked up to their highest values at a native 4K resolution. However, motion blur will be disabled for cleaner still images. Alright, so let's kick this comparison off by first taking a look at some of our Formula 1 cars. As always, a majority of the changes that can be observed when looking at these car models come as a direct result of actual real-life changes made to each respective team's vehicle, either to improve competitiveness or to account for updated regulations. This year, the Mercedes-AMG team even reverted their car's livery back to its older silver appearance, rather than the mostly black design used for the past couple of years. Other big changes include a drastic adjustment to the wing angles, much larger end plates, and the removal of the slot gap in between the nose and the bottom element. The sides of the vehicle have also seen a major redesign, with the carbon fiber floor fences and vanes mostly hidden by the extended side pods, giving a much sleeker look to the car. Moving on, we have Team Ferrari, who similarly have reverted a lot of the decisions made in past seasons with their latest F1 75. Like with Mercedes, Team Ferrari have removed the slot gap, connecting the nose directly with the main plane. But interestingly, the wings don't have nearly as aggressive of an angle as the 2021 car, and the main plane is slightly flatter as opposed to the previous curved design, while also making use of a full carbon fiber finish, rather than just the edges like before. On the sides, we have a similar change to the W13, where the design of the side pods and floor hide many of the previously exposed components, the result of which is a much wider signature when viewed from above. Meanwhile, the rear exhaust now sports only the tailpipe, with what appears to be an integrated wastegate, as opposed to the previous design where the wastegate exited directly above. For our last example, we have Team Red Bull's RB18, that shares a lot of the same basic changes that we've already observed, including a nose directly connected to the main plane, and wings that fully connect to the sides. Carbon fiber has also been used for the two upper spoilers, and they've adopted to only use 4 as opposed to the previous 5, with less aggressive angles overall. Additionally, the side pods have been expanded, and like the W13, the rear exhaust has had the external wastegate removed. But when it comes down to the actual visual fidelity, things aren't quite as plain to see. The differences here are almost all cosmetic, with the only exception being the more reflective properties of the materials that I'll talk about more in a bit. Moving on, we have the environmental design. As we've seen for the past 3 years straight, Codemasters has simply taken the same environments from tracks featured in previous entries and recycled them, making only minor tweaks in order to tie the game in with the new Formula 1 season. Monaco, for example, appears nearly identical in both games, with even a lot of the same NPC models populating the edges of the track. All the same building models, textures, and assets remain intact as well, and the fidelity of all those assets are more or less the same. However, there were a few odd changes made throughout that, while likely impossible to notice during normal gameplay conditions, are interesting nonetheless. This guardrail, for example, has had its detail reduced a decent amount, with the gaps at connecting points being removed, and the texture maps sporting far less detail than before. Then there's this strange visual glitch I encountered when viewing the chain link fence up close, where a strange colorful pattern is visible, rather than the typical metal pattern you'd expect to see. And then there's the grass, that for whatever reason seems to have had its scaling increased, making it seem not as complex and dense as before. But all of these changes are incredibly minor and practically impossible to notice. The only change visually that definitely stands out and seems to impact the visual fidelity of the game the most is the lighting design. When selecting identical tracks and lighting conditions, F1 22 has a slightly cooler tone to it, which seems to help the colors stand out from each other more than they did before. This Ferrari in particular stands out much better against the backdrop of the scene, though it's also worth noting that this seems to be mostly the result of F1 2022's improved ray tracing as well. Both 2021 and 2022 feature ray tracing, but 22's implementation is undoubtedly superior, with more detail reflected off of the surface of vehicles, and now several reflected surfaces in the environment as well. Before, many windows failed to reflect the game world, giving finish line areas a rather dull appearance. But if you look closely in 2022, every vehicle and most of the fundamental environmental assets are reflected in real time against transparent surfaces like windows, which makes for a much more immersive scene. F1 22 also appears to fix the issue with the screen space reflections that I noticed last year when driving in wet conditions, as these green and blue adverts can now be seen reflecting off of the pavement again, whereas before, the wet asphalt reflected nothing at all. Shadow quality for the most part hasn't really been altered in any discernible way. Shadows cast by vehicles are nearly identical as both games are using the same form of ray-traced shadows. And environmental shadows look about the same as they did last year as well, regardless of the time of day selected. That being said, Ambient Occlusion has been changed a good amount thanks to a new ray-traced Ambient Occlusion option. This changes the appearance of many assets in the environment, as edges now have a much more realistic shading depending on the time of day selected. This umbrella on the roof, for example, now looks like it's actually reflecting more light above than below, whereas before, light just seemed to wash over the entire model. The same is true for the balcony below it, that has much more accurate detail shadowing to really accentuate the architecture. With this improved ambient occlusion, the world has more depth than ever before, and the overall result is again a much more immersive game world to race around in. Other than that though, there really isn't anything else visually that stood out, at least not that I noticed. Effects are all handled in exactly the same way as before, including damage models, weather, and other things like spark particles that occasionally appear as vehicles scrape across the pavement. So, let's instead move on to our sound comparison. Which game do you think has the better audio quality and design?
Finishing time at the end of the race.
And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, F1 2022 doesn't reinvent the wheel, though this is also to be expected for this particular series. The big changes really boil down to the changes fans of F1 would expect for each vehicle, including their handling and performance on the track. But even still, there have been a few interesting changes mixed in, including some greatly improved ray tracing effects, along with some very unusual drops in quality to various environmental assets. F1 22 also features a few new tracks to race on, and even more interestingly, a separate supercar event option, allowing players to race something other than Formula 1 cars, likely to appeal to a wider audience. There's a few other odd additions like this, including the F1 Life integrated menu that tries to make the experience more immersive. But at the end of the day, F1 2022 is the same game as its predecessor, with some very minor visual changes and the expected seasonal adjustments to the cars. So, what do you guys think? Are you enjoying F1 2022, or was there something about last year's game that you still prefer? Let me know in the comment section. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this posted every week.